What if civilization doesn't begin? What if it restarts? What if the earliest cities on Earth were not built by people discovering how to live together for the first time, but by people trying to remember how it once worked? What if the oldest written records were never meant to explain who we are, but to quietly guide whoever came after everything fell apart? What if knowledge survives collapse differently than technology? Not as machines, not as monuments, but as patterns hidden inside routine? Tonight, we won't search for certainty. We won't claim what is true. Instead, we'll follow a sequence of possibilities. What if history doesn't move forward in a straight line, but circles back again and again, each time a little quieter? Let the questions remain open. Let the ideas drift. And as you begin to slow down, consider the first possibility. What if the first civilization was never meant to be the first at all? There is a moment just before sleep when the mind stops trying to organize everything. Facts loosen their grip, timelines soften, and ideas no longer need to compete. This is where we'll stay tonight. Not in certainty, not in argument, but in possibility. Imagine that history, as we usually tell it, is only the visible layer, the part that remained after something larger was lost. Imagine that what we call the beginning is simply the earliest moment we were able to remember clearly. Because when a world breaks, it doesn't erase everything, it erases context. Names vanish, origins blur, meanings thin out. What remains are fragments that still function, even when no one remembers why. A way to count, a way to measure time, a way to divide space, a way to organize people. These things don't need belief. They don't need explanation. They work quietly, long after stories fail. And if a civilization were to rebuild itself after collapse, it wouldn't begin with philosophy. It would begin with something smaller, something ordinary, something repeatable, something no one would think to protect, because no one would think it mattered. Which brings us to the first question we need to sit with. What if the most important record of humanity's recovery was never meant to feel important at all? Let's begin there, not with a myth, not with a god, but with a single unremarkable tablet that was doing exactly what it was designed to do: survive. What if civilization didn't begin? What if history doesn't start? What if history doesn't start the way we imagine it does? What if there is no true beginning, only the earliest moment we still remember clearly? We are used to thinking of civilization as a straight line, a slow climb from silence to speech, from stone to metal, from instinct to reason. But what if that picture is comforting rather than accurate? Because true beginnings are usually chaotic. They hesitate. They contradict themselves. They leave behind mistakes, half ideas, abandoned paths. Yet when we look at the earliest cities we can still see, they do not feel hesitant, they feel composed. What if that should trouble us? The first urban centers appear with streets already planned, with systems already coordinated, with social roles already defined. Not perfectly, but deliberately. There is no sense of a long rehearsal, no obvious record of trial and error, no visible phase where humanity seems unsure of what it is building. What if that absence matters? What if the earliest structures we find are not experiments, but implementations? History tells us these cities were learning. But what if learning had already happened? Somewhere else, sometime before what we now call history. What if what we see is not humanity inventing order, but reestablishing it? After all, when people truly begin something new, they argue about basics. They disagree about measurement. They disagree about time. They disagree about boundaries. But the earliest records show surprising agreement. The same ways of counting, the same divisions of the day, the same assumptions about space, labor, and value. What if agreement on that scale doesn't come from discovery, but from inheritance? Not inheritance of blood, but inheritance of structure. Imagine a world that has lost its stories, its explanations, its names. What remains after such a loss? Not myths, not philosophies. What remains are things that still work. A way to measure grain, a way to schedule seasons, a way to assign responsibility. These are not ideas you invent for beauty. They are ideas you recover for survival. And perhaps that is why the earliest evidence of civilization feels so calm, not excited, not triumphant. Calm in the way people become calm after something terrible has already happened. What if the silence before history is not emptiness, but aftermath? If that were true, then what we call the birth of civilization would not be a beginning at all. It would be a return to something familiar, performed by people who no longer remembered where that familiarity came from. And if that is the case, then the real question is not how did civilization begin, but something quieter. What happened that made it necessary to begin again? And to explore that possibility, we need to look more closely, not at temples, not at legends, but at the smallest and most ordinary records humanity left behind. Because sometimes the clearest evidence of recovery is hidden inside what looks like routine. And that brings us to the next question. What if the strangest thing about the first civilization is how little it looks like a beginning at all? In the strangeness of sudden order. What if true beginnings are messy? If you've ever watched something genuinely new come into existence, it rarely arrives complete. It stumbles. It contradicts itself. It leaves behind traces of confusion. Early attempts are inefficient. Measurements vary. Methods change. Beginnings argue with themselves. And yet, when we look at the earliest cities we still recognize as cities, we don't see that argument. We see agreement. What if that is the strangest part? Streets align, distances repeat, buildings follow shared proportions, not perfectly, but consistently. What if consistency is not the mark of invention, but of recollection? When people invent something for the first time, they test options. When people remember something, they choose. And choice implies familiarity. The earliest urban layouts do not feel improvised. They feel selected, as though someone already knew what would work and what would not. What if that knowledge did not emerge slowly, but arrived compressed? Not as stories, not as explanations, but as functional patterns. Patterns that could be repeated without understanding their origin. Because after a collapse, understanding is a luxury. Function is not. What survives catastrophe is not elegance, but reliability. And reliability does not ask why. It simply works. What if the earliest cities were built from such fragments? Not from inspiration, but from remembered solutions. A way to move water, a way to divide land, a way to organize labor. These are not philosophical achievements. They are survival decisions. What if they were chosen because they had already been tested, in a world no longer accessible to memory? When we search for the origins of civilization, we often look for signs of progress. But what if we should be looking for signs of restraint, for moments where people didn't experiment, for systems that appear finished before they appear explained? What if the absence of debate is more revealing than its presence? Imagine inheriting a set of instructions without knowing who wrote them. You would follow them because they worked, not because you believed in them. And over time, you might forget they were instructions at all. They would become tradition, then culture, then the way things have always been done. What if civilization began like that? Not as an act of creativity, but as an act of trust placed in patterns that survived something worse. If so, then the calmness of early order is not confidence. It is caution, the careful repetition of what is known to function when everything else has failed. And that raises a deeper possibility. What if the first civilization was not confident at all? What if it was careful because it knew what forgetting could cost? If that were true, then the earliest structures we see are not monuments to progress. They are scaffolding, temporary frameworks meant to hold society together while memory slowly faded. And if civilization began as scaffolding, then the real story does not start with cities. It starts with something far quieter, with the question of what knowledge can survive loss without being understood, which leads us to the next possibility. What if knowledge is most resilient when it hides inside routine? What if knowledge survives collapse better than people? What if knowledge does not disappear all at once? When a civilization collapses, it's easy to imagine everything vanishing together. Cities, language, tools, memory. But what if collapse is uneven? What if people are fragile, but ideas are not? Bodies need food, shelter, safety. Ideas need only repetition. What if that difference matters more than we realize? After catastrophe, the first thing to go is complexity. Large systems fail. Specialized roles disappear. Delicate chains of dependency break apart. But some forms of knowledge don't depend on stability. They depend on simplicity. A counting system can survive without schools. A calendar can survive without astronomers. A method can survive without its inventor. What if this is why certain ideas appear so early, not because they were discovered first, but because they were easiest to carry through loss? Think about what can be remembered without writing. A rhythm, a cycle, a repeated action. What if the most ancient knowledge was shaped to fit inside those limits? Not because ancient people lacked intelligence, but because they understood fragility. After a collapse, you don't save everything. You save what can be rebuilt. And to rebuild, knowledge must be compressible. What if civilizations once learned this lesson the hard way? What if, after losing too much, they stopped trying to preserve details and focused instead on preserving frameworks? Not how something was built, but how it was organized. Not why it worked, but that it did. This kind of knowledge doesn't announce itself. It hides inside habit. You don't teach it as theory. You perform it as routine. Over time, routine becomes invisible. People stop seeing it as knowledge at all. They call it tradition. They call it common sense. They call it the way things are done. But what if originally it was survival technology, a way to move through chaos without needing to understand it? What if the earliest civilizations were not trying to be clever? They were trying to be durable. Durability doesn't favor brilliance. It favors repetition. And repetition favors things that are easy to copy even when meaning fades. This might explain something subtle. Why the earliest records focus so heavily on logistics, on quantities, on schedules, on roles. Not because early people lacked imagination, but because imagination doesn't rebuild a world. Structure does. What if knowledge that survives catastrophe is not the knowledge that inspires, but the knowledge that coordinates, the kind that allows strangers to cooperate, the kind that turns survival into stability? If that is true, then civilization may not rise from genius. It may rise from memory reduced to function, And if memory can be reduced, then it can also be hidden, which leads us to a quiet but unsettling possibility. What if the most important instructions for rebuilding society were never written as instructions at all, but disguised as ordinary records that no one would think to erase? And that brings us closer to where those patterns were preserved, not in temples, not in myths, but in routine. Sakura, the order that comes before stories. What if order comes before meaning? We tend to believe that stories create structure, that myths come first and systems follow. But what if it's the other way around? What if structure must exist before stories can survive? After a collapse, explanations don't help. Belief doesn't coordinate effort. Philosophy doesn't distribute food. Myth doesn't decide when to plant. Order does, and order begins with agreement. Not agreement on values, but agreement on measure. How long is a day? When does a season begin? What counts as enough? These questions don't sound poetic, but without them, nothing else holds. What if this is why the earliest records focus so heavily on time? Days divided, months counted, years marked. Not because ancient people were obsessed with the sky, but because time is the first thing chaos distorts. When everything becomes uncertain, shared time restores predictability. A calendar is not a story, it's a promise that tomorrow will arrive when we expect it to. What if calendars were humanity's first act of trust after disaster? Before gods had names, before kings had lineages, before myths explained anything, people needed to know when to gather, when to rest, when to begin again. Time allowed strangers to cooperate without knowing each other. You didn't need to agree on meaning to agree on a date. And once time was shared, space could be divided, fields measured, canals aligned, streets repeated. Not because geometry was admired, but because geometry reduces conflict. Straight lines settle arguments that words cannot. What if this is why early order feels so impersonal? Because it wasn't designed to express identity. It was designed to prevent collapse from repeating itself. Stories are flexible. They change as they're told. But measurements resist change. They preserve consistency even when memory fades. What if that resistance is intentional? Imagine rebuilding a society with people who no longer share the same past. You wouldn't begin by explaining who they are. You would begin by showing them how to align their actions, where to stand, when to move, how much to give. Only later would stories return to explain why any of it mattered. What if myths are not the foundation of civilization, but the decoration that appears once the foundation is secure? If so, then the earliest order we see is not cold or inhuman. It is careful. Careful not to depend on belief. Careful not to require understanding, because understanding can be lost. But order, once practiced, can be repeated by anyone. And repetition is how civilizations survive long enough to remember themselves again. If that is true, then the absence of early stories is not a mystery. It is a strategy, a way of ensuring that something essential remains intact even when everything else dissolves. Which leads us to a quiet realization. What if the reason the earliest civilizations feel so structured is because structure was all they had left? And if that's the case, then we should stop searching for hidden messages in grand myths. We should look instead at the places no one thought to protect, the places where order hides best, inside routine, inside repetition, inside records that appear too ordinary to matter. And that is where the next possibility waits. What if the most important texts were never meant to be sacred at all? What if the most important texts were never meant to be sacred? What if survival manuals don't look like revelations? When we imagine ancient knowledge, we picture temples, priests, inscriptions meant to last forever. But what if that's exactly why truly important information avoided those places? Sacred texts attract attention. They invite reverence and destruction. Temples fall, altars are looted, symbols are erased by those who come after. But routine is ignored. No one burns inventory lists. No one rewrites tax records out of ideology. No one bothers to censor receipts. What if that made routine the safest hiding place of all? Imagine a world rebuilding itself slowly, carefully, aware, even if only faintly, that collapse can happen again. Would you engrave your most vital instructions onto monuments meant to impress? Or would you scatter them quietly through the paperwork of daily life? What if the most resilient knowledge was disguised as necessity? A list of deliveries, a schedule of work days, a record of rations. On the surface, nothing more than administration. But underneath, assumptions. Assumptions about time, about fairness, about proportion. Assumptions that teach without announcing themselves. Because when you copy a record, you copy its structure, even if you don't understand why it's shaped that way. What if that was intentional? What if the goal was not to preserve meaning, but to preserve form? Meaning argues, form repeats, and repetition outlives explanation. Think of how children learn before they understand. They imitate patterns long before they grasp reasons. What if early societies learned the same way? Not from teachers, but from templates. A civilization rebuilt from routine doesn't need consensus. It only needs continuity. And continuity doesn't care whether something is considered important. It only cares whether it's used. What if the reason we find so many administrative records is not because ancient people were obsessed with bureaucracy, but because bureaucracy was their memory system? A way to encode order so deeply into daily life that it could survive the loss of language, the loss of belief, even the loss of context. When meaning fades, habit remains, and habit quietly instructs the future. What if that is why the earliest civilizations left behind so many ordinary texts and so few explanations? Because explanations are fragile, but habits persist. If that's true, then we may have misunderstood what we're looking at. Those tablets aren't boring. They're careful. They don't speak loudly because they weren't meant to. They were meant to endure. And endurance doesn't require attention. It requires invisibility, which leads us to the next question, perhaps the most subtle one yet. What if repetition itself is a form of technology? On the logic that repeats itself. What if repetition is not redundancy? What if it is design? We usually associate progress with novelty, with change, with improvement. But survival favors something else entirely. Survival favors what can be repeated without distortion. After a collapse, there are no teachers left to explain why things work, no institutions to preserve theory, no time for debate. What remains are actions that can be copied exactly as they are. What if repetition is how knowledge learns to live without understanding? A system repeated often enough no longer needs explanation. People follow it because it fits, not because they know its origin. This kind of knowledge doesn't spread through instruction. It spreads through imitation. And imitation doesn't require belief. It only requires visibility. What if early societies were structured so that essential patterns were impossible to avoid? You didn't need to learn them. You lived inside them. Time was divided the same way everywhere you went. Work followed the same rhythms. Exchange followed the same ratios. Even disagreement occurred within predefined boundaries. What if those boundaries were the message? When a pattern repeats across generations, it stops feeling like a choice. It becomes reality, and reality is persuasive. What if the goal of early order was not to teach people what to think, but to shape how they acted long before thinking returned? Repetition does something subtle. It compresses complexity. You no longer need to remember why something exists if you remember how to do it. This is how skills survive when explanations vanish. This is how languages persist after meanings shift. This is how rituals outlast belief. What if civilization itself was designed to function like this? Not as a library of ideas, but as a living loop, a set of motions that could be repeated by anyone, anywhere, even after memory thinned. What if this is why early systems feel so impersonal? Because personality interferes with precision, emotion distorts memory, narrative invites reinterpretation, but repetition resists change. It stabilizes. And stabilization is exactly what a world needs after it has been shaken apart. Imagine inheriting a system without knowing it was inherited. You would assume it was natural. You would build around it, teach it without realizing you were teaching. Over time, the origin disappears. Only the pattern remains. What if this is how civilizations quietly reboot? Not through grand declarations, but through loops. Loops of time, loops of labor, loops of exchange, each one reinforcing the next. And once those loops are in place, the world begins to feel predictable again. Safe enough for stories to return, safe enough for gods to acquire names, safe enough for memory to grow elaborate. But underneath all of it, the repetition continues, silent, reliable. What if the earliest civilizations were not trying to preserve the past, but trying to ensure that something essential would repeat no matter what the future destroyed? If that is true, then collapse does not end civilization, it thins it. And what survives that thinning is not brilliance, it is rhythm, which brings us to the next threshold. Because repetition can carry knowledge across time, but it cannot carry everything. At some point, something breaks, and when it does, memory changes shape, which leads us to the next possibility. What if catastrophe is not an event, but a line that divides what can be remembered from what cannot? Joe, what if catastrophe is a line, not an event? Ask what if catastrophe is not something that happens, but something that divides? We tend to imagine disasters as moments, a storm, a fire, a flood, something loud, sudden, unmistakable. But what if the most important catastrophes are not defined by destruction, but by what comes after? What if catastrophe is the point where memory changes its shape? Before the line, knowledge feels continuous. After the line, it feels fragmented, not gone, just rearranged. What if this is why so many cultures speak of a before and an after, even when they disagree on the details? What if the details don't matter? What matters is the boundary. On one side of the line, things make sense without explanation. On the other, everything must be relearned. After catastrophe, people don't ask how the world works. They ask how to survive it. Complex systems collapse into simpler ones. Specialization retreats. Coordination narrows. What survives is not the best knowledge, but the most adaptable. What if this is why early civilizations feel both advanced and incomplete at the same time? As if they knew enough, but not everything. As if they were rebuilding from fragments that had already been filtered by loss. Catastrophe does not erase evenly. It removes depth first. Long chains of reasoning disappear. Context dissolves. Explanations fade. What remains are surfaces, actions without stories, rules without reasons, practices without origins. What if this is why ancient records often feel so precise and so silent at the same time? They tell us what was done, but rarely why, because the why belonged to the world on the other side of the line, and that world was gone. What if catastrophe is not the end of civilization, but the end of continuity? A break so deep that the past can no longer speak in full sentences, only in fragments, only in echoes. After such a break, memory does not disappear, it compresses. It folds itself into symbols, rituals, patterns that can survive without explanation. And those patterns become sacred, not because they are divine, but because they are all that remains. What if the reason we find so many origin stories is not because people wanted to explain beginnings, but because they were trying to make sense of a rupture they could no longer see? A rupture that turned inheritance into mystery. If that is true, then catastrophe is not a single disaster. It is the moment when memory loses its depth, and everything after that is an attempt to rebuild meaning from what still functions. Which leads us to the next question. Because if catastrophe reshapes memory, then survival requires more than remembering. It requires choosing what to forget. What if survival itself demands forgetting? And what if survival requires forgetting? And what if forgetting is not a failure of memory, but a requirement for survival? After a collapse, the world does not return all at once. It returns unevenly. Some things come back quickly: movement, hunger, cooperation. Other things do not. Complex explanations feel heavy. Long histories feel unnecessary. Too much detail becomes a burden. What if this is why memory begins to simplify? Not because people are careless, but because complexity slows rebuilding. When everything is broken, you don't preserve every detail. You preserve what allows life to continue. What if forgetting is how memory learns to travel light? Imagine trying to carry an entire civilization through a narrow passage of survival. Most of it won't fit, so something has to be left behind, not because it lacks value, but because it lacks immediacy. What remains is the core, not the story of how something came to be, but the part that still works without explanation. What if this is how myths are formed, not as fiction, but as compression, a long history folded into a short shape, a complex system reduced to a symbol, not because truth was unimportant, but because truth had to survive. In this process, details blur, names change, causes shift, but the structure remains. What if the flood stories that appear across cultures are not accounts of water, but memories of loss? A shorthand for the moment when the world became too large to remember all at once. What if the flood is a symbol, not of destruction, but of forgetting? A way of saying, everything before this is no longer accessible. After such a break, memory becomes selective. It chooses what to keep based on what can be repeated. Calendars survive because they organize action. Measures survive because they settle disputes. Rituals survive because they coordinate people. Explanations do not. What if this is why early civilizations feel both wise and strangely incomplete? Because wisdom survived, but context did not. The shape of knowledge remained, but its voice grew quiet. What if forgetting was not imposed from outside, but chosen from within? A necessary sacrifice to move forward. If that is true, then what we call ancient mystery may simply be the shadow left behind by intentional loss. And if memory can be shaped by forgetting, then it can also be shaped by guidance. Because after forgetting, someone always tries to help people remember, which leads us to the next possibility. What if teachers appear not at the beginning of civilization, but after it has been broken? What if teachers appear after collapse, not before it? What if teachers do not create civilizations, but help them recover? We often imagine guidance as something that comes at the beginning, a spark, a revelation, a first lesson. But what if guidance is only necessary after something has gone wrong? Before collapse, systems run on momentum. People follow what they've always known. Knowledge moves through habit. Order maintains itself. There is little need for teachers when memory is intact. But after catastrophe, memory fractures. What worked is no longer obvious. What was once automatic must be relearned. What if this is when teachers appear, not as rulers, not as founders, but as stabilizers, figures who do not invent systems, but reintroduce them, who do not explain everything, but demonstrate enough for repetition to begin again? What if the teachers remembered in ancient stories were not meant to be admired, but relied upon? Not because they were powerful, but because they were functional. They knew where to begin. What if that is why so many myths describe beings who arrive after disaster, not at the dawn of the world, but in its quiet aftermath? They appear when chaos has thinned, when survival has been secured, and when the question shifts from staying alive to living together again. What if their role was not to rule, but to align, to bring calendars back into sync, to reestablish shared measures, to assign roles that prevent conflict? These are not the actions of gods demanding worship. They are the actions of systems returning to coherence. What if later generations misunderstood this? What if functional guidance became ritualized? What if repetition turned teachers into symbols and symbols into gods? Over time, instruction becomes story, story becomes belief, and belief drifts far from function, but the original role remains buried underneath. What if the teachers of ancient memory were remembered not for who they were, but for what they restored? If that is true, then the question of their origin matters less than the effect they had. They appear, order returns, they withdraw, and the system continues without them. That pattern repeats across cultures, which suggests something unsettling. What if teachers are temporary by design? What if a system that depends on guidance forever has already failed? If so, then the disappearance of the teachers is not abandonment. It is success. The moment when repetition has taken over. The moment when civilization can run on memory again. But that success carries a cost, because once teachers are gone, the reasons behind the system begin to fade. And over time, people forget that the order they live inside was ever restored at all. They begin to believe it was always this way. Which brings us to the next possibility. What if the figures we later call gods were remembered engineers of recovery, not creators of the world? And what if gods are remembered engineers? And what if the word God is not a description of power, but a placeholder for function? Across ancient cultures, the figures we later call gods rarely behave like abstract forces. They organize, they assign, they regulate. They are responsible for water, for boundaries, for time, for law. What if that tells us something important? Creators create once, engineers maintain. What if the earliest divine figures were not remembered because they brought the world into being, but because they knew how to keep it from falling apart again. In the stories, these beings don't spend their time contemplating existence. They argue over logistics. They negotiate responsibilities. They distribute roles. One governs storms. Another oversees grain. Another tracks the movement of the sky. What if these are not symbols of nature, but descriptions of systems? Water management, agriculture, calendars. What if myth preserved job descriptions long after it forgot resumes? As generations pass, function turns into personality. A system becomes a character. A role gains a name. And eventually people stop seeing the structure beneath the story. They see intention where there was procedure. What if this is why ancient gods feel so specific, so limited? They are powerful, but only within their domain. They cannot do everything, because no system can. What if divinity was not about omnipotence, but about specialization? And what if that specialization was inherited from a world that already understood how fragile civilization could be? In that case, the gods were not meant to stay forever. They were transitional. They existed to restart coordination until repetition could take over again. Once people knew when to plant, how to count, how to align effort, the system no longer needed oversight, and so the gods recede, not because they are defeated, but because they are no longer required. What if this is why ancient stories describe a gradual distance between gods and humans? At first, they walk among people. They speak directly. They intervene. Later, they appear only in dreams, then only in rituals, finally only in memory. What if that distance is not loss, but automation? The moment when a system becomes stable enough to run without supervision. If that is true, then what we interpret as divine withdrawal is actually the final stage of recovery. The system is working, and once it works, its origin fades. People stop asking why it exists. They only notice it when it fails, which leads us to a fragile realization. If gods are remembered engineers, then forgetting them is inevitable, because functioning systems erase their creators. And when that forgetting happens, something else is lost as well. The ability to understand the system itself. Which brings us to the next question. What if the first thing humanity truly lost was not technology, but a shared way of thinking? What if language was the first thing we lost? What if the first true loss was not knowledge, but the way knowledge was shared? We often think of language as a tool for communication, a way to exchange information. But what if language is something more subtle? What if it is the shape of thought itself? Before collapse, ideas move freely because people think in compatible patterns. They don't just share words, they share assumptions. They know what a number implies, what a measure means, what a boundary represents. Language makes this invisible. It allows complex systems to feel simple. But after catastrophe, that invisibility disappears. People may still speak, but they no longer think the same way. Words remain, yet meanings drift. What if this is why the earliest civilizations appear strangely unified in structure, but divided in expression? They repeat the same patterns but explain them differently. What if the shared language that once carried deep structure was too fragile to survive loss? Because language depends on community, on continuity, on daily reinforcement. When communities fragment, language fragments with them. And once that happens, knowledge loses its native environment. It can still exist, but only as fragments translated into something simpler. What if this is why early systems persist, but their explanations feel hollow? Why measurements remain precise, But stories multiply. Stories fill the gap left by a lost way of thinking. They are attempts to translate structure into meaning, but translation is never perfect. Something is always left behind. What if the loss of a shared language turned direct understanding into metaphor? What if what we now call myth is simply what remains when precise thinking no longer fits into words? In that case, language didn't just describe civilization, it enabled it. And when it fractured, civilization could no longer fully explain itself. It could only repeat itself, which might explain why later cultures inherit systems they no longer fully comprehend. They follow rules whose origins feel sacred because explanation has been replaced by reverence. What if the loss of a shared language is what transforms engineering into religion? Once people can no longer discuss a system precisely, they begin to ritualize it. They preserve form, not function. Gesture replaces understanding, and over time, even the gesture becomes obscure. What if this is why civilizations keep building monuments? Not to demonstrate power, but to externalize memory, to put into stone what language can no longer hold. If that is true, then the first thing lost after collapse is not technology. It is the ability to think together. And once that ability is gone, every attempt to reconnect becomes symbolic rather than structural, which leads us to the next possibility. If language fails as a bridge, then humanity tries to build a different one. What if monuments are not expressions of ambition, but attempts to remember connection itself? What if we keep rebuilding the bridge wrong? What if monuments are not built to reach upward, but to remember what once came down? When language no longer holds the full shape of thought, people look for something heavier, something that doesn't drift, something that doesn't change its meaning with time. Stone. Stone does not argue, it does not translate, it does not forget. What if that is why civilizations turn to monuments when understanding begins to fade? Not to express ambition, but to stabilize memory. A monument does not explain, it anchors. What if the great structures of the ancient world were not messages meant to be read, but interfaces meant to be used, placed carefully, aligned deliberately, repeated across cultures that no longer shared a common tongue? If people could no longer think together, perhaps they could still act together. Stand here, look there, move at this time. Geometry does not require translation. Orientation does not depend on myth. What if monuments were built because they bypassed language entirely? A shared direction, a shared center, a shared rhythm with the sky. These things could coordinate people without needing words. What if this is why ancient structures often align with celestial cycles? Not because of worship, but because the sky was the last universal reference. Stars do not belong to one language. They rise for everyone. When shared speech disappears, the heavens remain common. What if building in stone was an attempt to recreate a lost interface, a way to reconnect human action with cosmic order when verbal understanding was no longer enough? In that sense, monuments are not expressions of pride, they are acts of longing, attempts to restore alignment when explanation has failed. But stone has limits. It can preserve position, but not intention. It can repeat form, but not meaning. Over time, the reason for alignment fades. Ritual replaces function. People remember that something was done, but forget why. What if this is why later civilizations inherit structures they can no longer fully use? They stand inside them, replicate them, revere them, without knowing what connection they were meant to restore. What if the bridge was rebuilt, but without its original language? If so, then every monument is both a success and a failure. It keeps memory from vanishing completely, but it also marks the moment when understanding became external, when knowledge could no longer live inside people alone. And when that happens, something subtle shifts. Civilization begins to mistake permanence for meaning. And once permanence becomes the goal, forgetting accelerates, which leads us to the next quiet realization. What if every civilization believes it is the first because it has forgotten how many bridges have already collapsed? What if every civilization thinks it's the first? What if confidence is not a sign of progress, but a symptom of forgetting? Every civilization at some point believes it has reached something unprecedented, a level of knowledge never seen before, a mastery no one else possessed, a complexity that could not possibly be lost. What if this belief appears not at the height of understanding, but at the edge of memory? When people forget how fragile systems are, they begin to trust them blindly. They stop asking how things work. They assume they always will. What if this is the moment when civilization becomes most vulnerable? The more complex a system becomes, the more invisible its foundations grow. Fewer people understand how it functions. Fewer people can rebuild it if it fails. Complexity creates comfort. Comfort erases caution. What if earlier civilizations learned this lesson too late? What if they also believed their knowledge was permanent, that their monuments would last, that their systems would endure, that their memory had finally escaped the cycle? And what if collapse taught them otherwise? Perhaps that is why the earliest recoveries feel careful, why early order avoids excess, why it relies on repetition rather than innovation. Those who have lost everything once do not rush to build towers. They build redundancies. What if each civilization that follows forgets this lesson a little more? With every recovery, memory grows thinner. Each time, less is carried forward. And eventually, a civilization arises that believes there was nothing before it worth remembering. At that point, the cycle feels complete, not because it has ended, but because it has reset again. What if history doesn't repeat itself loudly? What if it repeats quietly through patterns of confidence and neglect, through the belief that this time is different, that this knowledge is safer, that these records are secure, that this complexity cannot unravel? What if that belief has appeared at the end of every long memory? If so, then the true danger is not catastrophe. It is certainty. The certainty that nothing could interrupt the system. The certainty that forgetting is impossible. Because forgetting does not announce itself. It arrives gradually as fewer people understand more things. Until one day the system still works, but no one knows how to restore it. And that is when collapse stops being dramatic and becomes inevitable. Which brings us to the final question we need to sit with. Not about the past, but about us. What if we are writing for survivors too? What if we are writing for survivors too? What if we are not as different as we think? What if, like those before us, we believe our knowledge is safe simply because it surrounds us? Our world feels permanent. Information moves instantly. Memory lives in machines that never seem to sleep. But what if permanence is an illusion created by access? What if our systems only feel indestructible because they are still running? Most of what we know exists inside layers we rarely touch. Electricity, networks, codes written by people we will never meet. What if those layers failed quietly? Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to make restoration difficult. How much of what we know could be rebuilt without explanation, without manuals, without power? What if someone had to reconstruct our world from fragments, from habits, from routines, from whatever still worked? What would remain understandable? Would our calendars make sense? Would our measurements survive? Would our language still carry meaning once the systems that support it disappeared? What if future survivors looked at our ruins the way we look at ancient cities, impressed by scale, confused by purpose? What if they found our monuments, data centers, satellites, cities, but not the thinking that animated them? Would they assume we invented everything from nothing? Or would they sense that we too were inheritors? Because perhaps every civilization believes it is unique until it is studied from a distance. What if we are already part of the same pattern, compressing knowledge, trusting systems, forgetting how to rebuild them? And what if, without realizing it, we are also leaving messages behind? Not deliberate ones, not warnings, but habits, patterns of coordination, ways of counting time, assumptions about order. Things that might survive us even if our explanations do not. If that is true, then we are not so different from those who came before. We are not the first to believe that forgetting is impossible, and we will not be the last, which leaves us with one final possibility. Epilogue: to sleep like a civilization. What if sleep itself is a kind of reset? Each night the mind lets go of detail. Stories fade, explanations loosen. What remains is structure, rhythm, habit, familiar patterns that return in the morning without effort. Perhaps civilizations sleep the same way. They forget specifics to preserve function. They lose stories to keep order. And when they wake again, they rebuild from what still fits. Not because they remember everything, but because enough remains. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, you don't need to hold on to answers. You don't need certainty, just the quiet recognition that forgetting and remembering are not opposites. They are partners. And somewhere, long after questions have faded, patterns continue, waiting to be repeated, to be restored. What if remembering is not about the past at all, but about making the future possible?